If stories about second chances, lonely hearts, and unexpected kindnesses warm something inside you, then stick around. And maybe like and subscribe if you believe, like I do, that one small act of grace can change a life forever. Because this story isn't about grandeur or miracles. It's about a man who forgot what it meant to be human, and the single request that made him remember. The first time I saw Ethan Cole that winter, the city was dissolving under a curtain of snow, and his empire, the Cole Regency Hotel, stood like a beacon of order in a world that had gone still. The streets were empty, the Christmas lights dimmed by the blizzard that had grounded flights and silenced even the most frantic holiday rush. Inside, the marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers that threw light like frozen fire. Every detail precise, perfect, controlled, just like the man who owned it. Ethan had built his fortune on precision. He was the kind of CEO who could read a quarterly report like a surgeon reads an X-ray. Cold, clinical, decisive. But that night, sitting alone in his penthouse office, even the hum of the city below seemed reluctant to disturb him. He had turned off the holiday music that drifted faintly from the lobby speakers. He'd long ago learned that silence was easier than nostalgia. He wasn't supposed to be there, not really. Every year his staff insisted he take time off. Hawaii, Aspen, somewhere tropical or festive, but Ethan always declined. Christmas is for families, he would say, which sounded almost generous until you realized it was also an excuse. There was no family waiting for him. There hadn't been for a long time. The framed photo on his desk, his late wife smiling beside a Christmas tree, was the only evidence that once he'd known warmth. Now, he measured his worth in stock prices and property value. Grief had taught him that numbers were easier to control than people. Downstairs, though, chaos had a way of slipping past the rules. The blizzard had stranded travelers across the state, and the Cole Regency, despite its exclusivity, had become a refuge for the desperate. The lobby was overflowing. Families bundled in coats, couples arguing softly over canceled flights, children crying because Santa might not find them here. Ethan could have ignored it. He wanted to. But then the call came through from the front desk. "Mr. Cole, there's a woman here. She's asking if she can stay in the lobby overnight. Says she doesn't have a reservation." Ethan's reply was automatic. "We're full. She has a child with her," the manager added quietly. "A little girl. Maybe 5 or 6. He hesitated, just a fraction. His eyes went to the snow beating against the window. It would be below freezing soon. He pinched the bridge of his nose, as if the decision physically pained him. "Fine," he said at last. "Put them in the staff quarters." "There's no space left there either, sir." For the first time that evening, Ethan looked up from his papers. "Then where do you suggest?" There was a pause. "The presidential suite is empty." Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity. The suite, his suite, wasn't for guests. It was his private space when he'd visited the hotel. It was where he hid from holidays like this one. Still, something inside him, a quiet instinct he didn't recognize anymore, whispered, "It's Christmas." "Fine," he muttered. "Put them there. Just for tonight." By the time he descended to the lobby, curiosity had begun to eat at his irritation. He spotted them instantly. A young woman, maybe late 20s, her hair damp from melted snow, clutching a little girl wrapped in a pink coat. The child's cheeks were blotched red from the cold, but her eyes, wide, bright, unbroken, lifted toward the massive Christmas tree with a kind of reverence. Ethan's staff were apologetic but firm, telling the mother that everything was handled, that she'd been given a suite at no cost. The woman looked stunned. "Please thank whoever arranged this," she said softly. "You've no idea what this means to us." Ethan didn't step forward, though every instinct urged him to. Instead, he watched as they disappeared into the elevator, the little girl glancing back once, meeting his gaze briefly as if she knew exactly who he was. He told himself it was nothing, just a charitable act on a cold night. But hours later, as the snow piled high enough to bury the hotel's front steps, Ethan found himself standing outside that very suite, the muffled sound of laughter spilling through the door. He told himself he was checking on a guest. That's all. Yet when he raised his hand to knock, he hesitated. From within came the faintest voice, the child's again, clear and unafraid. "Mommy, do you think the lonely man upstairs has a Christmas tree?" Ethan froze. The words sank into him like a shard of ice and stayed there. The lonely man upstairs. How could a stranger see him so clearly? He turned to leave, but then came the small, certain sound of the girl's voice again, soft, full of hope. Maybe Santa will visit him too, if he stays with us tonight. And that was how it began. The night a lonely CEO's life unraveled in the quiet glow of a hotel Christmas tree, all because one child dared to ask him to stay. Morning came draped in silver light, the kind that makes even the coldest city look fragile and forgiving. The storm hadn't stopped, but it had softened, snowflakes falling slow and deliberate, as if time itself was reluctant to move forward. Ethan Cole stood in the hotel's grand lobby, watching the world blur behind frosted glass. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that little girl's face and heard her question echoing. Maybe Santa will visit him too, if he stays with us tonight. It had pierced something in him he'd long believed dead, and for the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone. When he finally left his penthouse, he found the hotel transformed. What had been a sterile refuge for the stranded was now alive with warmth. The staff, his staff, who once avoided eye contact in his presence, were laughing as they served coffee and pastries to guests gathered around the massive Christmas tree. Someone had started a fire in the stone hearth, its glow flickering across smiling faces. And in the middle of it all stood Sophie, the woman from the night before, wearing an oversized sweater, her hair tied up, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she helped serve hot cocoa. Lila, her daughter, was seated cross-legged on the floor beside the tree, carefully arranging paper snowflakes cut from hotel stationery. When she saw Ethan, her face lit up. "You came down," she squealed, as if he were an old friend rather than a stranger who'd given her a bed for the night. Sophie turned, startled, and nearly spilled the tray she was carrying. "Mr. Cole," she said, straightening quickly. I hope it's okay we're here. The guests were restless, and the kitchen had extra supplies, so I thought." "It's fine," Ethan said, more gently than he expected. "Actually, it's nice." The word felt strange on his tongue, like something unused. He helped her set the tray on a table, and for a moment their hands brushed. Her skin was cold from carrying the dishes, her fingers trembling slightly, but her smile was steady. "You don't look like someone who spends Christmas in an office," she said after a pause, tilting her head as she studied him. "And you don't look like someone who'd volunteer to entertain a lobby full of strangers." "I didn't have much choice," Lila insisted. Sophie glanced toward her daughter, who was now trying to hang a paper snowflake on a doorknob far too high for her to reach. She said no one should spend Christmas alone. Ethan followed her gaze. "She's perceptive." Sophie laughed softly. "Too perceptive. She thinks Santa's real and sadness is fixable if you just give people enough cookies." They shared a smile, the kind born not of amusement but recognition. A quiet understanding between two people who'd both seen the kind of pain that leaves fingerprints on your life. By afternoon, Ethan had stopped pretending he was supervising. He was simply there, watching Sophie turn an accident of weather into something that felt almost holy. She organized story time for the kids, convinced the bartender to make peppermint milkshakes, and coaxed the concierge into playing piano. The air smelled of cinnamon and coffee and laughter, things Ethan had forgotten hotels could hold. Later, as twilight sank into the snow, he found Sophie sitting alone near the window, her gaze distant. Lila had fallen asleep beside her, a blanket tucked around her small frame. "You did all this," Ethan said quietly. Sophie shook her head. "I just reminded people they weren't trapped. They were together." She looked up at him. "You ever notice how the loneliest places are the ones that look the most perfect?" He hesitated. Every day, they sat in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the fireplace. After a while, Sophie asked, "You don't go home for Christmas?" "I don't have one," Ethan said simply. "Not anymore." Something flickered in her eyes, pity, maybe, or understanding. "Then maybe this is it," she said, glancing around at the makeshift celebration. "Home doesn't always have walls you own. Sometimes it's just where someone's waiting for you to sit down." For a man who had built skyscrapers, the simplicity of that truth hit harder than he wanted to admit. As he looked at Sophie, her hair glowing faintly in the firelight, her daughter's tiny hand resting trustingly in hers, he felt something inside him shift, like the thawing of long frozen ground. That night, when most of the guests had gone to their rooms, Ethan found himself walking past the Christmas tree again, Lila was awake now, sleep-tousled and dreamy-eyed, waiting for her mother to finish cleaning up. She looked at him and whispered, "You didn't go upstairs." "No," he said softly. "Not tonight." She smiled, curling up beside the dying fire. "Good," she murmured, half asleep. "Santa doesn't like lonely people." Ethan watched her drift off, the glow of the fire painting warmth into her small face, and realized the strangest thing. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't either. By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city draped in white silence, like a world reborn. Sunlight poured through the glass atrium of the hotel, scattering off the snowbanks piled against the windows. Ethan Cole stood by the tree, watching as Lila toddled around with a mug of cocoa nearly too big for her hands, and Sophie spoke softly with one of the housekeepers. The lobby, once cold marble and muted tones, now looked alive, cluttered with toys, coats, and the residue of laughter. He'd always thought perfection was the absence of chaos. Now he realized perfection was this, the mess people leave behind when they felt safe. Sophie joined him by the window, her cheeks pink from the morning chill. "The roads are open," she said, almost apologetically. "They're running trains again. We should go." He nodded, but the thought of them leaving hit him harder than he expected. "You don't have to rush," he said. "There's plenty of room here." She smiled, soft and knowing. "You mean that literally, but not the way it sounds." Her tone wasn't teasing, just true. "We can't stay forever. But thank you for letting us have one good Christmas. I think we both needed it." Ethan wanted to say something more, something that might convince her to stay, but words had always failed him when they mattered most. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. "The presidential suite," he said, pressing it gently into her palm. "If you ever need a place to come back to. No reservations required." Sophie hesitated, her fingers brushing his. "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted softly. "Because last night, I remembered what it feels like when someone knocks on your door and you actually open it." She didn't answer at first, but the smile she gave him carried more warmth than any fire ever could. Lila tugged at her mother's sleeve then, holding up a paper snowflake she'd drawn a crooked heart in. "Mommy, can we leave this here for the lonely man? So he remembers us." Ethan crouched down beside her, his voice catching. "I think I'll remember you just fine." When they finally left, their footprints trailed through the snow outside the hotel. 2 small impressions, and 1 large, fading into the light. He watched until they disappeared around the corner, then turned back to the lobby where the paper snowflake hung crookedly from a branch of the tree. The heart in its center swayed gently, catching the morning sun. That spring, the Cole Regency introduced a new initiative, the Lila Project, offering free stays for families displaced during holidays. When Sophie received the email, she knew immediately who had written the proposal. And the next Christmas, when snow began to fall again, a familiar pair of knocks echoed through Ethan Cole's office door. Sophie stood there, Lila beside her, holding 2 cups of cocoa and a shy grin. "We thought maybe you shouldn't spend Christmas alone this time," Sophie said. Ethan smiled, a real one, unguarded and quiet. "Then I suppose," he said, opening the door wider, "you'd better stay with me tonight." Outside, the city lights glimmered like distant stars, but inside, for the first time in years, Ethan's world was bright enough on its own.